Snow, endless and absolute. It is a blanket that covers the world, muffling sound, erasing paths, preserving secrets. In the remote Ural Mountains of Russia, in the dead of winter 1959, the snow held a secret. A secret that began with a tent, discovered by a search party, half buried and silent. It should have been a shelter. Instead, it was a tombstone. The canvas was violently sliced open from the inside. The occupants, 9 experienced hikers, were gone. They had fled without their coats, without their shoes, into the crushing sub-zero wilderness where temperatures plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius. Why? What could possibly drive 9 seasoned mountaineers to abandon their only protection and run towards a certain frozen death? The search for their bodies would uncover a scene of methodical, baffling horror. Bodies found miles apart, some barely dressed, some with crushed ribs and fractured skulls, yet with no external signs of a struggle. One was missing her tongue. Their clothing was found to be radioactive. The official Soviet investigation was closed abruptly, its conclusion a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. The hikers died from a compelling natural force. For over 60 years, that phrase has echoed through history, a haunting admission that the truth was something too strange or too terrible to name. This is not just a story of a hiking trip gone wrong. It is a journey into one of the most chilling and persistent unsolved mysteries of the 20th century, a puzzle of science, conspiracy, and the unexplainable. We will walk in their final footsteps, examine the evidence the Soviets tried to bury, and explore every terrifying theory, from avalanches and secret military weapons to something far, far older, lurking in the silence of the snow. The question is not just what killed them, but what were they running from?
Before the mystery, there was the adventure. Before the horror, there was hope. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand them. They were not novices. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, a generation of young Soviets filled with the optimism of the post-Stalinist thaw. They were engineers, physicists, modern minds but with old souls drawn to the wilderness. They were seasoned in the hardships of the trail, having achieved a Grade 2 certification for hikers, preparing for the highest certification, Grade 3. Their leader was Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, a gifted radio engineering student and an experienced, meticulous trekker. His name, tragically, would one day become synonymous with the mystery itself. With him were 8 others, each a distinct personality captured in the haunting black and white photos they left behind. Zinaida Kolmogorova, just 22, the vibrant and resilient heart of the group, her diary entries filled with emotion and determination. Ludmila Dubinina, only 20, known for her courage and for singing songs to keep spirits high. Alexander Kolyevatov, 24, a student of nuclear physics, described as methodical and reserved, a quiet pillar of strength. Rustam Slobodin, 23, the strong and athletic one, a graduate engineer. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko, both 21, the jokers of the pack, their playful antics documented in the early photos of the trip. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, a man of French descent, a civil engineer respected for his experience and good humor. And then there was Semyon Zolotarev. The oldest at 38, he was a mysterious and somewhat enigmatic figure, a military veteran of World War II, a physical education instructor. He had joined the group at the last minute, and no one seemed to know him well. His presence adds another layer of intrigue to an already complex story. Their goal was ambitious, a badge of honor in the Soviet trekking community, a 16-day, 300-kilometer expedition to traverse the northern Urals and conquer Mount Otorten. In the language of the local Mansi people, Otorten meant "don't go there." It was a warning they, in their youthful confidence, did not heed. They began their journey with laughter and camaraderie. Their diaries and photographs paint a vivid picture. We see them on the train, then a truck, then skis, moving farther and farther from civilization. The diaries speak of snowball fights, of songs sung around a makeshift stove inside the tent, of the majestic, silent beauty of the winter landscape. They were not looking for death. They were celebrating life in its most vivid form. On February 1st, they began their ascent towards Otorten, but bad weather, a worsening storm with powerful winds, pushed them off course, westwards, towards the slopes of another mountain, a mountain known to the Mansi as Kolatsiach. In their language, it has a far more ominous name, Dead Mountain. It was here, on this desolate slope, that they decided to make camp for the night. The last entry in their group diary, written on that day, is mundane, filled with technical details about the trek. There is no hint of fear, no premonition of doom. The final photograph, recovered from one of their cameras, is a strange, blurry image, taken in near darkness. It is abstract, chaotic. Some say it shows the flash of a camera being fired in panic at an approaching object. Others say it is nothing at all, a simple accidental exposure. But after that photo, there was only silence.
That silence would last for 3 weeks, as the world outside remained blissfully unaware that on the frozen slope of Dead Mountain, a nightmare had unfolded. The expedition was supposed to end on February 12th, the day they were scheduled to send a telegram from the village of Vijay. When no message came, the families began to worry, but delays were common in such harsh expeditions. A few more days passed. Still nothing. By February 20th, the alarm was officially raised and a search and rescue operation was launched. Volunteer students, their friends, were the first to respond, followed by the Army and civilian aircraft. For days, they found nothing. The endless white expanse of the Urals yielded no clues. The weather was horrific. Then, on February 26th, a pilot spotted it, a single dark shape against the snow on the slope of Kolatsiakl. It was the tent. The search party on the ground made their way to the site, and what they found was not a scene of a simple accident. It was a scene of utter, inexplicable panic. The tent was half collapsed, covered in a thick layer of snow, but it had not been crushed. A ski pole used to anchor the entrance was still standing upright, and the canvas, it had been methodically cut and ripped open from the inside. This was the first chilling piece of the puzzle. They hadn't unzipped the entrance. They had slashed their way out in a desperate hurry to escape something inside or immediately outside the tent. Inside, all of the group's belongings were left behind, neatly arranged. Their coats, their boots, their food, their maps, their axes, everything an experienced hiker would need to survive in the brutal cold, abandoned. It was as if they had fled from a threat so sudden, so terrifying, that they had no time to even think about self-preservation. From the tent, a single set of footprints led down the slope towards a sparse tree line about a mile away. The footprints themselves were a mystery. They were made by 8 or 9 people wearing only socks or a single boot, or who were completely barefoot. In -30-degree weather, this was a death sentence. And stranger still, the tracks were not scattered as if from a panicked flight. They descended the slope in an orderly fashion, side by side, suggesting a calm, deliberate retreat from a scene of sheer panic. The contradiction was baffling. Why slash your way out of a tent in a frenzy, only to walk calmly away into a frozen wasteland? The search party followed the tracks.
The tracks led them to the edge of the forest, where they found the remains of a small fire beneath a towering cedar tree. And there they found the first two bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were stripped down to their underwear. Their hands were raw and burned, as if they had frantically tried to climb up the cedar tree. Branches on the tree, up to 15 feet high, were broken, suggesting someone had climbed up, perhaps to get a better view or to escape something on the ground. A short distance away, between the cedar tree and the camp, the searchers found the next three bodies. Igor Dyatlov, the leader, was lying on his back, his hand clutching a small birch branch, his face turned towards the tent, as if he had been trying to return. Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustem Slobodin were found nearby, also seemingly trying to crawl back up the slope to the safety of their abandoned shelter. Slobodin had a minor skull fracture, but the cause of death for all five was the same: hypothermia. Their deaths were tragic but logical. They froze to death after fleeing their tent underdressed. The initial conclusion was simple: a terrible accident. Perhaps an avalanche had scared them. They got lost in the darkness and succumbed to the cold. It was a neat, plausible explanation. But the search was not over. 4 hikers were still missing.
It would take another 2 long months, after the snow began to melt, for the true, unspeakable horror of the Dyatlov Pass Incident to be revealed. The search continued, a grim and desperate affair. Finally, in early May, as the winter snows receded under the spring sun, a Mansi hunter discovered a den buried under 13 feet of snow in a ravine about 250 feet from the cedar tree. Here, the final pieces of the puzzle were found, and they would shatter every simple theory proposed so far. The bodies of Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and Ludmila Dubinina were located. They were better dressed than the others. In a strange, desperate act of survival, they appeared to have taken clothes from their friends who had already died. Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of Krivonishenko's woolen pants. Zolotaryov was found wearing Dubinina's hat and coat. It was a grim tableau of their final, desperate struggle. But it was the nature of their injuries that transformed this case from a tragic accident into an enduring enigma. The medical examination revealed something horrifying. 3 of the 4 hikers had sustained massive, fatal internal trauma. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a severe, crushing skull fracture. Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov had their chests crushed. Dubinina had multiple fractured ribs on both sides. Zolotaryov had a similar flail chest injury. The doctor who performed the autopsies, Boris Vazrodjeny, stated in his report that the force required to cause such damage was equivalent to being hit by a car or the shock wave from a powerful explosion. It was extreme, powerful, and utterly devastating. And yet, here was the impossible detail. There were no corresponding external injuries. No cuts, no bruises, no soft tissue damage. It was as if they had been squeezed or crushed by an immense invisible pressure. They had not been attacked by a wild animal. There were no bite marks or scratches. They had not been in a fight. Their bodies showed no signs of a struggle. The doctor was explicit. This force was not of human origin, as a blow from a human being could not be so strong. It was something else. The horror did not end there. Upon closer examination of Ludmila Dubinina, the medical examiners made another gruesome discovery. Her tongue, hyoid bone, and parts of her mouth tissue, including her palate, were missing. There was no clear explanation for this.
Some suggested it was natural decay from lying in a stream of running water, but others found this explanation insufficient, especially given the state of the other bodies and the lack of scavenging marks. The final, bizarre clue came from the laboratory. When the clothes of the last 4 hikers, particularly Zolotaryov's sweater and Dubinina's clothing, were tested for radiation, they were found to be contaminated with low levels of beta radioactive isotopes. The source of this radiation was never identified. Suddenly, every simple theory evaporated. An avalanche could not explain the massive, selective internal trauma without any external trauma. It could not explain the missing tongue. It could not explain the radioactivity. The scene in the ravine painted a picture not of a natural accident, but of a violent, high-energy event. The hikers had not just frozen to death. They had been subjected to an unknown, powerful, and terrifying force. The Soviet authorities had a major problem on their hands. They had a case with no witnesses, no suspects, and evidence that defied rational explanation. Their next move would only deepen the mystery and fuel decades of suspicion and conspiracy.
In the face of baffling and terrifying evidence, the human mind seeks comfort in the rational. It seeks a logical explanation, an anchor of normalcy in a sea of the strange. For the Dyatlov Pass Incident, that anchor has long been the avalanche theory. For decades, it has been the most widely accepted scientific explanation, the one that attempts to neatly tie up all the loose, horrifying ends. The theory goes something like this. The hikers made a critical mistake by cutting into the snow slope to set up their tent. This destabilized the snowpack above them. During the night, a slab avalanche occurred. It was not a massive cinematic avalanche that buries everything in its path. Instead, it was a smaller, more localized slide of a heavy slab of snow. This slab slid down and landed on the tent, not burying it completely, but crushing part of it and landing on the sleeping hikers. This initial impact would explain the brutal internal injuries sustained by Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol. Their chests and skulls were crushed by the immense weight of the snow, all without creating external wounds, much like how a person can be crushed in a car accident without breaking the skin. The sudden, terrifying weight of the snow and the darkness would have induced a state of sheer panic. Injured and fearing a second, larger avalanche, they made the split-second irrational decision to cut their way out of the tent rather than risk being buried alive, trying to find the zipper. Once outside, in the disorienting, freezing darkness, they fled down the slope. The theory of paradoxical undressing is then used to explain their lack of clothing. This is a known phenomenon in cases of severe hypothermia. As a person freezes to death, their constricted blood vessels near the skin suddenly dilate, creating a sensation of intense heat, causing them to feel as if they are burning up and irrationally remove their clothes. The final stage of hypothermia also causes confusion and disorientation, which would explain why they wandered in different directions and failed to return to the relative safety of the tent. So, we have an explanation for the tent, the injuries, and the lack of clothing. It seems plausible. It is scientific. It is neat. But it is also full of holes. The investigators at the scene in 1959, experienced men of the mountains, saw no signs of an avalanche. The tent was not completely buried. The ski pole was still standing. The footprints leading away from the tent were clear, not covered by any subsequent snowfall from a slide. Furthermore, the topography of the slope was not steep enough for a typical avalanche. It had a grade of less than 30 degrees, generally considered safe. And then there are the other details. The avalanche theory does not explain the radioactivity on the clothes. It does not offer a definitive explanation for Lyudmila Dubinina's missing tongue, often waving it away as animal scavenging, despite the lack of other marks. And it does not account for the testimony of other hiking groups and locals
who reported seeing strange orange spheres, or lights, in the sky on the night of the incident. For every question the avalanche theory answers, it seems to ignore two more. It is a rational explanation, but it feels incomplete. It feels like an attempt to force a round peg into a square hole, ignoring the jagged, unexplainable edges of the case. The truth, many believe, is not buried in the snow, but in the secrets of the Cold War.
When the evidence defies logic and the official story feels incomplete, suspicion naturally turns towards those in power. The Dyatlov Pass Incident occurred at the height of the Cold War, a time of intense paranoia, secrecy, and military experimentation in the Soviet Union. For many researchers, the strangest parts of the mystery are not the injuries or the radioactivity, but the actions of the Soviet authorities themselves. Their investigation was shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning. The files were classified. The area around Kholatsyakhl was sealed off to civilian hikers for 3 years after the incident. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was ordered by high-ranking regional officials to close the case. He did so, writing the now infamous conclusion that the hikers were killed by a compelling natural force. Years later, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ivanov gave a stunning interview. He admitted that he was forced to drop the investigation. He said that he and the officials above him were completely baffled by the case. But more than that, he revealed his own personal belief. He believed the compelling natural force was connected to the orange spheres. Ivanov confirmed that he had received multiple reports from other hikers, military personnel, and even the meteorology service of strange, fast-moving, silent orange orbs of light in the sky over the northern Urals throughout February and March of 1959. He had wanted to investigate this angle, but was explicitly told to drop it and classify all related materials. This testimony is the cornerstone of the military cover-up theory. The theory posits that the hikers were accidental witnesses to and victims of a secret weapons test. The Ural Mountains were a hub of Soviet military and nuclear activity. The infamous Mayak nuclear facility was in the region, site of the 1957 Kyshtym disaster. What if the hikers stumbled upon something they were not supposed to see? The theory branches into several possibilities. Perhaps it was a test of a new type of rocket or missile that went awry. An explosion from such a weapon could create a concussive blast wave powerful enough to cause the massive internal injuries without leaving shrapnel or external marks. The orange spheres could have been the visual manifestation of this technology. This would also explain the traces of radioactivity found on the victims' clothing. The hikers, terrified by the explosion and light show, fled their tent. Some were caught in the blast wave, others succumbed to the cold. The Soviet military, realizing what had happened, moved in to control the situation. They staged the scene to look like an accident and then silenced anyone who got too close to the truth, including Lev Ivanov. This theory elegantly explains the internal injuries, the orange spheres, the radioactivity, and, most importantly, the bizarre and secretive behavior of the authorities. It transforms the case from a random natural tragedy into a story of human error, military secrecy, and a brutal cover-up. It suggests that the monster on Dead Mountain was not a creature of snow or legend, but a monster of our own creation.
What if the force that killed the hikers was not a secret weapon, nor a simple avalanche? What if it was something both natural and profoundly strange, a force that attacks not the body, but the mind itself? This leads us to one of the most fascinating and unsettling theories, infrasound. Infrasound is low-frequency sound, below the range of human hearing. While we cannot hear it, our bodies can feel it. At high intensities, infrasound can have bizarre and dangerous physiological and psychological effects. It can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, sorrow, and even terror. It can vibrate our internal organs, cause shortness of breath, and create visual distortions as it resonates with the fluid in our eyeballs. The theory suggests that a specific set of weather conditions around Dead Mountain that night could have created a powerful infrasound vortex. A phenomenon known as a Kármán vortex street can occur when wind moves over a mountain dome, creating a series of spinning vortices. These vortices can, under the right conditions, generate intense infrasound. Imagine the hikers asleep in their tent. Suddenly, they are bombarded by this silent, invisible force. They are overcome by a wave of irrational, inexplicable terror. Their hearts pound, they can't breathe, they feel a sense of absolute dread, as if something terrible is right outside the tent. They don't know what it is, but their most primal survival instincts scream at them to run. This would explain the panic, the cutting of the tent, and the flight into the snow. They weren't running from a visible threat, they were running from a feeling so powerful it overrode all logic and reason. This theory, however, does not directly explain the massive internal injuries. Proponents suggest that once outside the tent, the hikers could have been hit by a katabatic wind. This is a powerful, dense downdraft of cold air that can race down a slope at incredible speeds, well over 100 miles per hour. Being hit by such a force could be like being hit by a train, potentially causing the crush injury seen on the victims. It's a compelling combination of two rare but known natural phenomena. It paints a picture of nature itself becoming a weapon, using invisible forces of sound and wind to drive the hikers mad and then crush them. It's a scientific theory, yet it feels like something out of a horror story. It suggests that the compelling natural force was not a euphemism for a military secret, but a literal description of an event so strange and powerful that the investigators themselves could not comprehend it. There are no conspiracies here, no monsters, just the terrifying and different power of the natural world operating in ways we are only just beginning to understand. The enemy was in the air itself, silent, invisible, and inescapable.
For centuries, before the Soviets, before the hikers, the Ural Mountains belonged to the Mansi people. They were hunters and reindeer herders, people who knew the mountains, its secrets, and its dangers. The very names they gave the land, Otorten, don't go there, and Kolatsiako, dead mountain, were warnings. Warnings born of experience and legend. When we strip away the Cold War paranoia and the complex meteorological theories, we are left with a simpler, more primal question. Did the hikers encounter something the Mansi already knew about? The investigation in 1959 briefly considered the possibility that the hikers were attacked by local Mansi tribesmen. But this was quickly dismissed. The hikers' belongings were all accounted for, ruling out robbery. The nature of the injuries was not consistent with a human attack. And most importantly, there was no evidence of anyone else being in the area. But the Mansi themselves spoke of other things. Legends of large, ape-like creatures that roamed the remote forests. They called them the Menk. These creatures were described as tall, hairy, and incredibly strong, often hostile to humans who encroached on their territory. Stories of the Menk, or the Russian Yeti, have been a part of local folklore for generations. Could the hikers have stumbled upon such a creature? Could this explain the sheer terror that drove them from their tent? A large, powerful creature could certainly inflict the kind of devastating crush injuries found on the victims. It might also explain why Ludmila Dubinina's tongue was missing, ripped out in an act of brutal, animalistic violence. This theory, while speculative, addresses the two biggest weaknesses of the avalanche theory: the extreme injuries and the overwhelming sense of panic. An attack by a large, unknown creature would certainly cause a group of people to flee for their lives, abandoning all their gear. However, there is a profound lack of physical evidence. There were no animal tracks found at the scene other than those of the hikers themselves. There was no hair, no blood, nothing to suggest the presence of a large cryptid. The theory relies entirely on folklore and the interpretation of the injuries. It is a theory born of the unknown, filling the vacuum of evidence with a creature from our collective nightmares. For many, it is too much of a leap, but for others,
It is the only explanation that fits the sheer primal terror of the scene on Dead Mountain. It suggests that the compelling natural force was not weather or weapons, but something alive, something ancient, something that wants to be left alone. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass in this light becomes a chilling reminder that there may still be corners of our world that do not belong to us.
For 60 years, the Dyatlov Pass case was officially closed, living on only in the world of books, documentaries, and internet forums. The original files were locked away, the questions left to fester. But in 2019, driven by renewed public interest and the persistent lobbying of the victims' families, the Russian Prosecutor General's office announced it was reopening the investigation. The world held its breath. Would modern technology finally solve the 60-year-old mystery? Hopes were high that new forensic techniques, DNA analysis, and advanced modeling could shed new light on the case. However, the scope of the new investigation was immediately disappointing to many. The prosecutors announced they would only be investigating theories related to natural phenomena. All theories involving criminal acts, military involvement, or anything paranormal were dismissed from the outset. Their focus was almost exclusively on the avalanche theory. A team of experts was dispatched to the site in March 2019 under conditions similar to those in 1959. They conducted tests, took measurements, and used sophisticated computer models to simulate the snowpack on the slope. In July 2020, they announced their official conclusion. The cause of death was, once again, an avalanche. They elaborated on the old theory, suggesting that a specific type of delayed slab avalanche was the culprit. They argued that poor visibility on the night of the incident caused the hikers to wander away from their tent and get lost. They dismissed the radiation as coming from thorium gas mantles the hikers had in their lamps. They dismissed the orange spheres as either meteors or missile tests from a distant launch site. And they claimed the internal injuries were consistent with being crushed by snow. The case was, once again, officially closed. For the Russian government, the mystery was solved. But for the families, the independent researchers, and the global community of sleuths who have followed the case for decades, this conclusion was deeply unsatisfying. It felt less like a genuine investigation and more like a bureaucratic exercise to put the matter to rest once and for all. It failed to convincingly explain the most perplexing evidence. Why were the footprints so orderly if they were fleeing in panic? Why did the original 1959 investigators see no evidence of a slide? How could a slab avalanche, which the new investigation admitted was likely small, cause such specific and devastating trauma to some while leaving others untouched? The new investigation, instead of providing closure, only seemed to add another layer of frustration. It highlighted the vast gap between the official story and the bizarre, stubborn facts of the case. The mystery of Dyatlov Pass had once again resisted a simple explanation. Science had spoken, but the ghosts of Dead Mountain remained silent, their story still untold.
So where does the truth lie? We have journeyed through a labyrinth of possibilities, each one compelling and each one flawed. We have the avalanche theory, the neat scientific explanation that seems to ignore the most bizarre evidence. We have the military cover-up, a theory that fits the facts but lacks definitive proof, relying instead on the shadows of the Cold War. We have the theories of infrasound and katabatic winds, which paint a terrifying picture of nature as an invisible killer. And we have the primal fears of the unknown, of creatures lurking in the snows, a story as old as humanity itself. The enduring power of the Dyatlov Pass incident lies in its refusal to be solved. It is a perfect mystery. Every piece of evidence that supports one theory seems to contradict another. It is a mosaic of contradictions. Panic and order. extreme trauma with no external signs, a deliberate investigation that concluded with a deliberately vague answer. The incident serves as a stark and humbling reminder of the limits of our knowledge. In a world where we can map the human genome and peer into the farthest reaches of the universe, there are still places on our own planet where the fundamental questions of what happened and why remain utterly unanswered. It forces us to confront the idea that there are forces, both natural and man-made, that operate beyond our current understanding. Perhaps the answer is a combination of these theories. A small avalanche combined with infrasound-induced panic, followed by an encounter with military personnel cleaning up a secret test. Or perhaps the truth is something else entirely, something so strange that we haven't even conceived of it yet. The 9 hikers on Kholat Sakal did not just die. They became a story, a modern legend. Their faces, young and full of life in their final photographs, have become the faces of the unknown. They are a permanent question mark etched into the fabric of history. Their story challenges us. It demands that we keep questioning, keep searching, and remain humble in the face of a universe that is far stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine. The files may be closed, but for those who seek the truth, the case is never over. The snow on Dead Mountain may melt and fall again, but the enigma it holds remains frozen in time, as cold and as silent as the 9 bodies discovered there so long ago. The story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident does not end with the theories. It ends with a silence. The silence of a mystery unsolved. The silence of 9 lives cut short, and the silence of the mountains which hold the truth and refuse to speak. This incident has become more than just a cold case. It has become a cultural touchstone, a piece of modern folklore that speaks to our deepest fears. Fear of the unknown, fear of the indifferent power of nature, fear of secretive authorities and the things they hide from us, and the most terrifying fear of all, the fear of an enemy we cannot see or understand. In the end, what we are left with is the human element. The faces in the photographs, the words in the diaries, the unimaginable terror they must have felt in their final moments, fleeing into a storm of cold and confusion. We are left with the families who never received a real answer, who have had to live for decades with a gaping hole of uncertainty. The legacy of Dyatlov Pass is a powerful cautionary tale. It reminds us of the fragility of life and how quickly a joyful adventure can turn into an incomprehensible nightmare. It teaches us that no matter how experienced or prepared we are, there are forces in this world that are far beyond our control. But it also speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit, the spirit of the searchers who refuse to give up, the spirit of the investigators who, even when silenced, hinted at a deeper truth, and the spirit of a global community of curious minds who, over half a century later, refused to let the story die. They keep the memory of the 9 hikers alive, not as victims of a strange event, but as individuals whose final journey became one of history's greatest questions. The wind still howls over Kholat Sakal. The snow still falls. And somewhere in that vast, silent wilderness, the answer waits. We may never find it, but we will never stop searching. Because in searching for what happened to them, we are also searching for a deeper understanding of our world and our place within it, its vast and often terrifying mysteries. The 9 hikers are gone, but their echo remains, an echo in the silence, a question that may never be answered.